After more than 30 years of practicing medicine, I can tell you that one of the most common things I hear from my patients goes something like this. Doctor, I eat pretty well. I cook at home. I buy ground beef from the grocery store like everyone else. And then they're surprised when I tell them that the package of ground beef sitting in their refrigerator right now might be hiding things they'd never expect. I'm not talking about anything sinister. I'm talking about small details on the label, in the color, in the texture, that most shoppers walk right past without a second glance. And over time, those small details can add up to bigger problems than people realize, especially as we get older and our digestive systems, our hearts, and our immune responses aren't quite what they used to be. So let me share something with you today that I wish every one of my patients knew before they pushed their cart down the meat aisle. I'm Dr. Edward Collins. I've spent over 3 decades working with patients, many of them in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, helping them sort through the noise about what's actually healthy and what isn't. And one thing I've learned in all those years is that the food choices we make at the grocery store often matter more than the supplements we take, the vitamins we swallow, or the diets we try, especially when it comes to something as common as everyday as ground beef. Let me ask you something. Have you ever picked up a package of ground beef, glanced at the price, looked at the color, and tossed it in your cart without really reading the label? Most of us have. I certainly have. And there's nothing wrong with that on a busy Tuesday afternoon. But there are 9 specific red flags that once you know what to look for will completely change the way you shop. Let me tell you about a patient of mine. I'll call her Margaret. She was 68 years old, recently widowed, and doing her best to cook for herself the way she used to cook for her husband. She came into my office one afternoon complaining about persistent stomach upset, mild but constant, that had been going on for a few weeks. She thought it was just stress, or maybe age catching up with her. She told me she'd been making the same meals she'd always made: spaghetti with meat sauce, meatloaf on Sundays, chili when the weather turned cold. When we talked through it, I asked her where she was buying her ground beef. She mentioned a particular store and a particular type of package, the big economy size, the kind that looks like a great deal. And she'd been freezing portions of it for weeks. Now, Margaret hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. But she also didn't realize that the way that beef had been processed, packaged, and stored, combined with how she was thawing and refreezing it, was likely contributing to her discomfort. Once we made a few changes, things got better within about 10 days. That's what I want to help you avoid today. Not by scaring you, but by giving you the same information I gave her. Here's the thing about ground beef. When you buy a steak, you're buying one piece of muscle from one animal. Simple. But ground beef is different. A single package of ground beef can contain meat from dozens, sometimes hundreds of different animals, all blended together. And the way it's processed, the temperature it's kept at, the additives that may or may not be in it, the fat content, the freshness, all of these things matter, especially for those of us over 55, because our bodies process food differently than they did at 25. Our stomach acid is often lower, which means we're more vulnerable to bacteria. Our kidneys filter sodium less efficiently. Our hearts respond more strongly to saturated fat. So what we eat and how clean it is matters more now than ever before. So let's go through the 9 red flags. Pay attention especially to the last few, because those are the ones most people miss completely. The first red flag is color that looks too uniform or too bright. Now, fresh ground beef should be a deep, rich red on the outside, sometimes with a slightly darker, purplish color on the inside where it hasn't been exposed to oxygen. That's normal. That's actually a good sign. What you don't want to see is meat that looks unnaturally bright, almost cherry red across the entire package with no variation at all. In some cases, this can indicate the meat has been treated with carbon monoxide gas during packaging, a process that's legal in the United States but banned in many other countries because it can keep meat looking fresh long after it would normally start to turn. The meat may still be safe, but the visual cue you'd normally rely on, that browning that tells you something's getting old, has been removed. So you lose your ability to tell how fresh it really is. If the color looks too perfect, too even, too bright, that's worth a second thought. The second red flag is a high percentage of fat hidden in vague labeling. You'll often see packages labeled simply ground beef without a lean-to-fat ratio. By law in the United States, ground beef can contain up to 30% fat. That means nearly a third of what you're buying may not be meat at all. For most of my patients over 55, especially those watching their cholesterol or managing heart conditions, that's a significant amount of saturated fat to be eating without realizing it. Look for clear labeling: 85% lean, 90% lean, 93% lean. If the package just says ground beef with no ratio, assume it's on the fattier end. Here's where it gets interesting. The third red flag is the phrase mechanically separated or finely textured anywhere on the label or in the ingredient list. Now, regular ground beef is exactly what it sounds like: cuts of beef put through a grinder. But some products use processes that recover smaller bits of meat from bones and trimmings using machinery, sometimes treated with substances to kill bacteria. There's been a lot of public discussion about this over the years. The product is regulated and considered safe by federal authorities, but many people prefer to avoid it simply because it's not what they picture when they think of ground beef. If you see any language like that, and you'd rather just have straightforward ground muscle meat, put it back and find something else. The fourth red flag is excessive liquid in the package. A little bit of pinkish liquid, what people sometimes call purge, is normal. That's just myoglobin and water from the muscle tissue. But if the package is swimming in liquid, if the meat looks like it's sitting in a puddle, that often means the meat has been frozen and thawed, possibly more than once, or that it's been sitting around longer than it should. Repeated freezing and thawing breaks down the cell structure, releases more moisture, and creates an environment where bacteria can multiply more quickly once the meat is thawed. For older adults, whose immune systems may not respond to foodborne bacteria as robustly as they once did, this matters. The fifth red flag, and most people don't realize this one, is a sell-by date that's the same day you're buying it, or just one day away. Now, sell-by dates aren't expiration dates. The meat doesn't suddenly go bad at midnight. But ground beef has a much larger surface area than a steak, which means more opportunity for bacteria to grow. If you're buying ground beef on its sell-by date, you really need to either cook it that same evening or freeze it immediately. And if you're like a lot of my patients who buy groceries on Saturday morning and don't plan to cook beef until Wednesday, that sell-by date matters a great deal. Always check it. Always give yourself at least a few days of buffer. The sixth red flag is packaging that's torn, leaking, or puffed up. A torn package means contamination is possible. A leaking package, the same. But a puffed up package, where the plastic is bulging slightly, can be a sign of bacterial growth producing gas inside. This is rare in modern grocery stores, but I've seen it happen. If anything looks off about the integrity of the package, don't buy it, no matter how good the price is. The next one is especially important. The seventh red flag is buying pre-formed patties or pre-seasoned ground beef without checking the ingredient list. A lot of people assume that pre-formed hamburger patties or seasoned ground beef sold in the meat case are just beef and spices. In many cases, they contain added water, soy protein, breadcrumbs, sodium phosphates, and a long list of preservatives. Some of these ingredients are used to bind the meat, hold moisture, or extend shelf life. None of them are dangerous in small amounts, but if you're managing high blood pressure, kidney function, or heart health, the added sodium alone can be significant. Some pre-seasoned products contain over 500 milligrams of sodium per 4-ounce serving before you've added a single thing to it. Always, always read the ingredient list. If it's longer than 2 or 3 items, you're not really buying ground beef anymore. You're buying a meat product. The eighth red flag is unusually low prices that seem too good to be true. I'm not saying expensive meat is always better. That's not true either. But when you see ground beef priced dramatically lower than everything else around it, there's usually a reason. It might be older, closer to its sell-by date, from a less desirable cut, or contain a higher percentage of fat and trim. Sometimes it's a legitimate sale, and that's fine. But pair a very low price with a sell-by date that's right around the corner, and you've got a package that needs to be cooked or frozen the same day you bring it home. Most of my patients who get into trouble with ground beef do so because they buy a bargain, then forget about it in the back of the fridge for 4 or 5 days. And the ninth red flag, and this is the one almost nobody thinks about, is meat from the self-service case that's been ground in-store but with no clear date or labeling about when it was ground. Some grocery stores grind their own beef, which can actually be a wonderful thing. Fresher, often better quality, sometimes from specific cuts you can see being ground right there. But if there's no clear ground today label, no date, no information about what cut it came from, you're flying blind. Ask the butcher. A good meat counter will tell you exactly when it was ground and what went into it. If they can't or won't, that tells you something too. Let me tell you about another patient of mine. His name was Frank, 72 years old, retired engineer, the kind of man who likes to know exactly how things work. He came to see me because his blood pressure had crept up over several months, and he was frustrated because he hadn't changed anything about his lifestyle. Same exercise, same general diet, same routines. But when we sat down and walked through what he was actually eating, we discovered that he'd switched, about 6 months earlier, from buying fresh ground beef at the butcher counter to buying pre-seasoned, pre-formed patties from the freezer section. He thought he was saving time, and he was. But those patties contained more than 4 times the sodium of plain ground beef, and he was eating them 3 or 4 times a week. We didn't change anything else. He just went back to buying plain ground beef, seasoning it himself with whatever he wanted, and forming his own patties. 3 months later, his blood pressure had come down measurably. Not because of any medication, just because of what was and wasn't in the meat he was eating. Frank told me he felt a little foolish at first. I told him he shouldn't. These things are designed to be convenient, and convenience often hides a cost. So what do you actually do with all this information? Let me give you a few practical steps that don't require you to overhaul your entire grocery routine. First, when you walk up to the meat case, look at the color carefully. You want a natural, slightly varied red, not a uniform, bright cherry red. Pick up the package, check for excess liquid, and look for any tearing or bulging. Read the label for a clear lean-to-fat ratio. 85% lean is a reasonable middle ground for most people. 90% or higher if you're watching saturated fat closely. Second, always check the sell-by date and give yourself at least 2 to 3 days of buffer if you're not cooking it immediately. If you're not going to cook it within that window, freeze it the same day you bring it home, in portions you'll actually use, not in one giant lump. Third, avoid pre-seasoned, pre-formed, and heavily processed ground beef products unless you've read the ingredient list carefully. Plain ground beef plus your own seasoning is almost always cheaper, lower in sodium, and exactly what you think it is. Fourth, if your store has a butcher counter, get to know the people there. Ask when the beef was ground. Ask what cuts went into it. A good butcher loves these questions. They'll often give you fresher, better quality meat than what's pre-packaged out front, sometimes for a similar price. Fifth, when you cook ground beef, cook it to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Use a meat thermometer if you have one. This isn't being overly cautious. For those of us over 55, the consequences of foodborne illness can be more serious and longer lasting than they would be for a younger person, and ground beef carries more risk than whole cuts because of how it's processed. And finally, if you have specific health conditions, high blood pressure, kidney issues, heart disease, talk to your own doctor about how often and how much red meat is right for you. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. Some of my patients do beautifully eating lean ground beef 2 or 3 times a week. Others do better limiting it more. Your doctor knows your situation in a way no video can. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. None of what I've shared today is meant to scare you away from ground beef. It's a perfectly fine food, eaten thoughtfully, in reasonable amounts, prepared correctly. The problem isn't ground beef. The problem is that most of us have been buying it on autopilot for decades, never really looking at what's in the package, never asking the questions that would actually protect our health. Small changes matter. Reading the label matters. Knowing what to look for matters. You don't need to become an expert. You just need to slow down for an extra 30 seconds at the meat case and pay attention to the things we talked about today. I've watched patients in their 60s, 70s, even their 80s make small adjustments like these and feel real, measurable differences in how they feel day to day. Less digestive trouble, better blood pressure, more energy. Not because of any miracle, just because they started paying attention. You've already done the most important thing by watching this video all the way through. You're paying attention. That puts you ahead of most shoppers walking into the grocery store this week. Trust your eyes, trust the label, trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to ask questions at the meat counter. The people behind it almost always want to help. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the people you cook for. And I'll see you next time.